Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that we're really not discussing anything new. I think most of us have finally come to the conclusion that whatever happened on 7 October, and I'm still not convinced that that was not allowed to happen for reasons that we've already mentioned in the past, that the decision then to attack had very little to do with what happened on the 7th of October and everything to do with a long-term strategic plan to begin the process of ethnically cleansing, expelling, or murdering, whatever you want to call it, the Arabs in Gaza and ultimately the Arabs on the West Bank. And I think that's very clearly the case. He judged, and I think for the reasons that we've discussed already, particularly his control over the Congress, his control ultimately of the White House and of U.S. foreign and defense policy, that Israel was prepared to execute this long-term strategic plan now, and this was the ideal time to do it. Now, it hasn't worked out very well, as we all know. Gaza is hardly conquered. The Israeli Defense Force on the ground has taken very serious casualties. I'm told there are over 70,000 seriously injured Israeli soldiers. When I say serious, I'm talking about amputees, terrible wounds in Israeli hospitals. They don't admit to it, but there are at least 5,000 killed in action and maybe a lot more, but we have no way of knowing because no one really tells the truth about casualties during wartime. So the Israeli Defense Force is in terrible condition. Now, against this backdrop, he paints this seven-front war, which he thinks compels him to attack into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. It's astonishing. In other words, he wants to multiply the numbers of enemies that Israel's got. Of course, he'll take the position that everybody in the region hates Israel anyway. Israel is a state with no friends, and consequently, it doesn't make any difference what he does. So he might as well set out to kill as many of them as he possibly can. And he sees killing all of these enemies as the precondition for peace and security for Israel in the region. It's a little strange in my judgment, but clearly that's his view.
But he said that it's your trouble, it's your danger as well. He obviously meant other than the Israelis. He has an IDF, which has stated publicly several times as recently as yesterday that they cannot defeat Hamas. Many observers who are not biased against Israel have concluded that he has actually been defeated in his efforts to defeat Hamas. Is there any evidence that Iran wants to conquer Saudi Arabia? Does he know what he's talking about, Colonel?
No, but that doesn't matter. This is his best opportunity to ultimately drag the United States into war on behalf of Israel. And he's got enormous support. We've thoroughly demonized Iran in this country to the point where the average American hears Iran and thinks, oh, it's a terrible terrorist state committing atrocities everywhere. So he's banking on the ability to bring us into this conflict. On a strategic level, one of the things that the British Empire practiced very successfully until 1914 was a strategy called economy of enemies. The British, until they were stupid enough to enter the First World War, practiced this to the point where they were able to isolate almost every major enemy they fought and build alliances. Unfortunately, Israel has no alliances and no friends and no support anymore in the region. No one, Sunni or Shia, makes no difference, is interested in helping Israel do what it's doing. So his only hope is the United States. Obviously, the British will probably tag along with us if we end up doing it. But that's his best shot, his best hope, and that's where he stands. And this notion of conquest, the only people that are judged as being embarked on conquest are the Israelis. And increasingly, the Muslims in the region have decided that Israel is waging a war against the House of Islam in an attempt to establish unambiguous Jewish military, political, economic hegemony in the Middle East.
Launches against Hezbollah. because he will be in a position that makes it very difficult for all the people that have been taking lots of money for many, many years in support of Israel to stand up and suddenly say, no, we're no longer going to support you. Please don't attack Hezbollah and Israel and American. Support is the Navy, is the Air Force up to it, or are they too feminized and weak? Your colleague Colonel Wilkerson says we only have 2 aircraft carriers that are seaworthy. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't mean that we could not get others ready to go. But the point is, what are we putting at risk? You know, if the Houthis can strike an aircraft carrier with very modest capability, very modest missiles or drones and do some damage, what could a power like Iran do? Or for that matter, even Hezbollah or beyond that? Ultimately, the Turks, others that may decide to join into this. And once it becomes clear that Israel is losing and cannot win, there will be an ugly bloodletting because the wounded animal called Israel will be attacked viciously. This is the problem with Netanyahu's whole approach. No one wants to attack Israel at the moment, but when it stumbles badly, it's already stumbled. But when it stumbles very badly in a war with Hezbollah, potentially Iran, then will happen. So, you know, how do I frame this? We can't stop that, and you know, we just can't. We don't have the combat power to compensate for the emergence of a regional alignment against Israel. We can't do it, which is why any competent president and administration would have long ago stepped in and said, that's it, no more. You've come as far as you can. We've got to come to some sort of arrangement. And then this destructive war in Gaza, well, nobody did it. And Mr. Netanyahu has the imperial bit between his teeth, and he's prepared to run the course even though it's suicidal. Recently we learned that the United States sent medium-range missiles to the Philippines, and then we learned this morning that those missiles are being recalled. Can you provide an explanation of what this is all about? A sudden introduction of sobriety and common sense? I don't know. I mean, there's this obsession with multiple wars on multiple continents that we cannot possibly win, one of which is against China. You know, China is, well, there's an old saying in the Navy, a ship's a fool to fight a fort, and it simply means that if you're going to use air and naval power against something like China, you have no chance whatsoever of winning. I think there's also, privately, a recognition that China presents no threat to the Philippines or anybody in Southeast Asia. Nor does China want to invade Taiwan. There is no evidence for preparations to do that. There are no massive forces gathering anywhere to do it, and so somebody finally said, well, let's back away from this because we've got our hands full right now in eastern Ukraine and potentially the Middle East. That's the only way I can conclude that someone made the decision to pull those missiles out. Moving on to Ukraine. We recently learned, as recently as 2 hours ago, when we saw photos that Russia is preparing for a massive river crossing and engaged in substantial military exercises preparing to cross a river with men and equipment. Can you give a feeling about what that is all about? Well, first of all, in northeastern Ukraine, there has been for some time now a very large concentration of Russian combat power, an estimated 300,000 troops. Those troops are there for a purpose, and we, most of us looking at that, have assumed that this force would be hurled straight at Kiev at some point and ultimately cross the Dnieper River. I don't know if this particular exercise is connected to that or not. The Russians are actually very good at crossing rivers. We, by the way, are not. They perfected, you know, the technology that allows them to very rapidly establish bridges, and they are accustomed to routinely crossing them in training. The weather now is ideal for the purpose of river crossing, so it would not be surprising to me that they are prepositioning river crossing assets along with these forces for that purpose. Now, there are lots of rivers in eastern Ukraine, not just the Dnieper. Some of these border Russia and Ukraine, and the Russians may cross at any number of different places with these bridging assets. You know, they use this thing we call a ribbon bridge. It's been around a long time. It first appeared actually in 1973 across the Suez. Now, the ones they have today are better, more reliable, and very rapidly deployable. So what is it? Why do they call it a ribbon bridge? Because it's pieced together. You literally dump the bridge portions or pieces into the water, they float, then they are effectively bolted together. And within a very short period of time, you can cross a very large river. And that's that. These are carried on the backs of trucks or armored vehicles. So they back them up to the river, these go in, the engineers get to them very rapidly, bolt them together. I mean, you're talking about something that could be put together in 25-30 minutes across a major river like the Delaware River in between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, or even the Hudson River. Okay, and you've already got the forces up there. And as I said, this is something they do very well. They became very good river crossers during the Second World War, and they, unlike us, have never lost that ability.